I'm K.R. Davidson, and this is Our Nation Today, where we unpack the story behind the headlines. Canada's largest civil service union is considering taking legal action against the Canada Revenue Agency. This is after the CRA ruled that damages from the Phoenix pay settlement system are taxable. Problems with the Phoenix payroll system resulted in federal government employees being overpaid, underpaid, and even not paid at all. The settlement payments dealt with damages relating to financial, mental, and emotional harm suffered by the federal public service due to the Phoenix system. The CRA says it was only able to review the issue if a joint statement of facts was issued by both the union and the government agency in charge of the payments. However, no such joint statement was provided. Nathaniel, senior researcher, writer, and analyst at the Newsforum, is with me to examine the story behind the headlines. Okay, so a story behind the headlines that the government has some flaws in some of their management, I guess, more expressly here in a payroll system.
Yeah.
I've got to give kudos here to the Ottawa Citizen. They detailed this out in a timeline going back to Brian Mulroney's government.
That's exactly it. I mean, there might be some temptation for governments or parties to cast the fingers of blame at each other, but this issue goes back to 1989 was when they started looking into consolidating the federal payroll system, which was previously done on a regional pay scale system. So
they did it regionally because their system was so archaic that they actually couldn't have a centralized. So they wanted to be able to have some efficiencies. They haven't really found any efficiencies, and now what's their price tag? $2.6 billion
to stabilize the system. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is stabilize, of course, could mean they're just trying to stop the damages from flowing.
But I take a look from my years in business, and if you mess with somebody's paycheck, you're really identifying that there's substantial issues at play with the employer.
Massive.
And so,
I mean, the 200,000 public servants were affected by this, right? This is according to the Public Service Alliance of Canada. That is about 2/3 of the federal public service, which is around 300,000 right now.
And I want to give fairness to it. It's complex. There's multiple unions, multiple collective bargaining units, overtime issues.
This is the entire thing. What was at the root of the Phoenix system is that federal pay is very complicated.
Correct.
And they tried, in some ways, some might say very swiftly, to try to push everything through and get it done into the new Phoenix pay system when maybe they should have taken a bit more time.
And I think they also premised it based on the concept of cost savings. So they brought a significant amount of employees, tried to whittle it down. But I think when you go too quickly on some of these things that are massive in nature, you start to see the repercussions. But I think we're seeing something even greater with if I'm putting on my history cap here, right? You go to the Mackenzie King days of government, and he had C.D. Howe running the government, and he ran it like a top. And I don't know if I've seen a figure like that since those days. And we constantly see that the government's just sort of changing hands from government to government. I'm not hearing that great manager of Canadian government anymore.
Yeah, I think, that's a valid point to bring up, but just I think touching on that cost savings thing that we were just mentioning, Brian Mulroney, John Chrétien tried to bring something in the 90s.
He scrapped it. And he actually scrapped what Mulroney was bringing in.
2008, under the Harper government, there was a move towards cost savings. Of course, we were in the middle of the recession at the time.
Yes.
2009, it began. The public service initiative began for the Phoenix system, and then it was there was a change of government in 2015, and they pressed ahead with the pressing the button go on Phoenix.
So just in closing, they get a settlement, and what bothers me here is they knew very well in the settlement that this issue was going to be on the table. They could have clearly outlined, hey, this is damages, this is for back pay. Right. They left this for obviously the courts are going to have to fix it. So. Yeah. So in Greek mythology, the phoenix is supposedly a sign of renewal. But in the case of the federal government's implementation of their more than troubled payroll system, it is anything but. A former Auditor General, upon examining the issues associated with the failure, stated that there are pervasive cultural problems that allow for troubled projects to continue unchecked in the government. Unfortunately, this is indicative of greater issues than the failure to steward the implementation of a payroll system. The management of the federal government as a whole is reflected in the lack of being able to simply pay its employees. And this is now a decades-long issue. Larger questions loom in this respect. Stay with us as we look at calls from the opposition to fire the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. after these commercial messages. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. Canada's official opposition is calling on the Prime Minister to fire his Chief of Staff. The Tories say Katie Telford was aware of allegations of sexual misconduct by the former Chief of Defence Staff. The Prime Minister, however, says both his office and the Defence Minister's office were unaware of the allegations, in that they were of a sexual nature. We're going to take a look at a clip from Aaron O'Toole, Leader of the Opposition, speaking on this to the news.
If the Prime Minister is telling the truth and he wants Canadians to believe that he had no knowledge of an allegation of sexual misconduct brought with respect to Mr. Vance, he should fire his Chief of Staff. The Prime Minister repeatedly commended the former Chief of Defence Staff for his work regarding sexual misconduct in the armed forces, and Ms. Telford let the Prime Minister do that. She knowingly let the Prime Minister suggest that General Vance was a champion for Operation Honour, when he was really an example of the kind of behaviour Operation Honour was trying to stamp out.
So an interesting story here. There's internal documents showing that the PMO's office was actually alerted to this. Minister Sajjan, I believe there was, sorry, the gentleman's name's escaping, Gary Walburns, right, testified saying that the minister was aware that the allegations were of a sexual nature. There's documents saying the PMO's office was aware of it. What are we really dealing with? I think they've got to deal with the issue, and whether it lands on Katie Telford or the Prime Minister, I think it has to be dealt with.
Totally, it needs to be dealt with. The situation, I think, needs to be separated. I know I get a bit confused when some of these things happen in Parliament, so I think we need to separate the allegations against the Chief of Defence, former Chief of Defence Staff. Sure. We'll put that in its own pile right now, and why the Leader of the Opposition is calling for the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to be fired is because she is alleged to have known about it, and didn't tell the Prime Minister. So this is a bit more,
and that's what they've said. But they've also said that this was handed over to the Privy Council, and that they didn't want to have political interference. But the reality is, we've got the Chief of Defence who's leading Operation Honour. Problem with sexual assaults in the military. So this is a huge issue. Now the Liberals actually canceled the Defence Committee that was scheduled to possibly call Katie Telford as a witness.
Right. They were debating it. They were filibustering. Talked out the clock on Friday. Then the meeting on Monday was canceled shortly before it was slated to begin. So that's a bit of a...
And they're coming back on Friday, I hear. So I imagine this part's not going away.
Well, it doesn't seem to be going away as an issue. However, I think the main issue is that the Prime Minister's office and the Defence Minister's office both were alleged to have known about this in 2018, according to the former ombudsman, military ombudsman. And yet, and nothing was done about it. And I mean, in fairness, the Liberals say they followed all the appropriate procedures. The opposition says, you're the government. You knew this was an issue. You could have done more. So,
I saw the interview with the Minister of Defense with Mercedes Stephenson, and 5 times it was put to him. Were you aware? And I've never seen such an awkward interview, if I could be frank. So, so clearly they are aware of it. The question is, what's the ramifications of that?
And this is the thing. PMO knows. I mean, I know that
PMO always knows.
PMO always knows because centralization. And I know that you had some thoughts on centralization in Canada.
Well, we're really seeing. We actually saw the centralization of the PMO really expand under Justin Trudeau's father. Right. So before, I think Pearson was the last Prime Minister that would qualify himself as first among equals.
Right. The cabinet government style.
That's right. But the reality is that wasn't even true. Pearson was still centralizing power, and we saw that with Mackenzie King as well. Right. But the reality is when you have this concentration of power, you can have that concentration of power, but you have accountability that comes with it. You can't have both. You can't escape the responsibility, but yet want to control everything at the same time.
Right. So. Yeah. No, this is an issue that's not only happening in Canada, even though Canada
Canada's
maybe a world leader on this issue.
I think maybe India is probably going.
I was looking at it. You see it in India as well. You see concerns about it in Australia.
We don't see the same degree of centralization in the UK or other Commonwealth jurisdictions. So, Franklin Roosevelt stated, "With greater power comes great responsibility." No one can dispute that Canada's centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office has become pronounced, and that most federal government activity revolves around the PMO's office. The challenge is that the PMO needs to be able to account for its actions, for better or for worse, and this appears to continue to highlight the issues with the concentration of power in this respect, specifically with the regress of power away from Parliament and into the hands of the PMO. Stay with us as we will be looking at the Ontario government initiative to advance educational opportunities to Indigenous people in the sciences. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. An Ontario agency that provides technical advice to First Nations throughout the province is launching a new program. The Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation is aiming to have 30 Indigenous students enroll in a STEM mentorship program this summer. STEM is an acronym that stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. The executive director says the program goes hand in hand with her agency's mandate to create technical self-reliance in First Nations communities. Nathaniel is with me to examine this story in greater detail. Give us a little bit more background on this, Nathaniel.
Right.
We've got an Ontario agency allocates some funds to see Indigenous communities grow in STEM. We clearly know that there's higher paying jobs that come from STEM, et cetera, but give us a little bit more background on STEM.
Higher paying jobs, more leadership opportunities, not just in First Nations communities throughout the province, throughout Canada. This is part of the agency's mandate. But then also it's going to help with the technical self-reliance on reserves. I know in particular issues around water engineers.
Which we recently talked about, and obviously I think most people are familiar with some of the water issues that a lot of Indigenous communities are facing. Right. So I think that it would be great to be able to have that core group of engineers based from an Indigenous background. So when we take a look at the numbers, though, we see probably about, I think approximately 4% of Canadians are employed in STEM. We see about 2% Indigenous, so there's definitely a disparity to make up, and I think that this is a great initiative. But let's take a look at a larger issue here. STEM paying jobs, they pay more, and pay more than your regular Bachelor of Arts or whatever you and I study.
Well, that's exactly it. So I found it interesting that STEM, it's a term that a lot of people have seen coming around a bit more: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But then there's another term that's out there, which I think you and I would have both fit under as well, which is BASE, or business, humanities, health, arts, social science,
the people that don't earn as much as the people that have STEM degrees, right? But there's a lot of job opportunities in STEM as well. So it's interesting for the Indigenous groups that are actually educated in this area. You actually see that their employment is almost neck and neck with non-Indigenous groups, which is fantastic. But I think what's happening here at the core, and I actually really applaud them, is you don't just see here we're going to have X amount of STEM positions available at university. They're actually starting this in grade 7, where you're starting to deal with the issues, so you're starting to embed this, because this might not be inherent in certain Indigenous communities as mentorship, an avenue, right?
Mentorship for any of these STEM fields, I think, is crucial, and the fact that they're pulling in a mentorship, it's a hands-on learning experience, so you really get to integrate that into your daily life as well as your education. So I think it's a fantastic program.
And then they're starting this right away. They're starting it online, and then you'd hope that as things progress, that there would just be that more
plans to launch it in fall. So hopefully 30 students sign up by fall.
But as well, I think when we're taking a look at it, I think one of the challenges that we really see is that we have a poverty issue in Canada, and it largely relates to Indigenous communities. I think the stats are clear. 50% of the children in Indigenous communities are deemed to be impoverished, have issues with education, health, and otherwise. So it's nice to be able to actually see that this might be a vehicle to be able to combat that, because we're dealing decade after decade without any real change or variance.
I was just about to jump on that point, is that we actually don't see much of a change in terms of the rates of poverty going down over time, decade over decade. So this is a serious issue for child poverty on reserves, or children living in poverty on reserves.
Well, and when we look at this when we look at international poverty issues, education and health are always preeminent at the front to be able to deal with these issues. So I think that there's even a greater question is, how do you start to implement this at even a younger age? So Because if you're like me, if you got me in high school and tried to convince me to go into science then, I don't know. But maybe if somebody was talking to me and exposing it to me at an earlier age, you're starting to see something more there.
And it's the variety. You think engineering, but there's also STEM involvement in even the video game industry or things like that. So,
of course there is. Of course there is. So Marian Wright Edelman stated that education is for improving the lives of others and for leaving your community and the world better than you found it. When Canadians witness poverty rates in Indigenous communities basically unchanged from decade to decade, the question emerges, how does the Golden Rule apply, not only to our neighbor, but to those most in need in our own house? Quite simply, one of the greatest tools to combat poverty is by providing educational opportunities that can allow Indigenous families and communities to thrive, not only in an effort to be self-sustaining, but to allow all Canadians to enjoy the benefits of living in a country that, as of 2021, is ranked as the best country in the world. Stay with us. After these messages, we will be looking at the expansion of terrorism in Africa. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. According to a government official in Burkina Faso, at least 30 people were killed by gunmen in the eastern part of the country on Monday. Burkina Faso is located in West Africa and has been facing a growing threat from jihadist groups, with the Global Terrorism Index saying the country has suffered the largest increase in terrorism deaths globally. Unfortunately, the country is not alone. Terrorism and armed violence have been growing in the Sahel since 2012. Despite international efforts to stabilize the region, there are few signs of success, and a call for a change to strategy is being made. Nathaniel, this is a serious issue. We're seeing jihadist groups move from the Middle East down into sub-Saharan Africa, and we're seeing governments just not being able to respond to this. Can you give us some further details on this?
Right. So let's first define where we're looking at. The story is about Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is located in the Sahel, which is the region in between the Sahara Desert in the north and sub-Saharan.
Basically, it crosses Africa along the Saharan Desert.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So including countries like Mali, Burkina Faso.
And Mali's had significant issues.
Well, and Mali is actually where it started, because there was a Tuareg, an ethnic Tuareg rebellion in 2012, which became co-opted by jihadist groups. French came in to help stabilize Mali, but after the kinetic contact, the rebellion spread into the desert and spread around the region. So,
and we're seeing, here at Burkina Faso's military, 6,000. It's just not able to keep up with some of the influence that's being brought in. But it's my understanding that there's some infighting going on in the jihadist groups as well. So right. you've got Al Qaeda on one side, and then you've got ISIS on the other side, or the Islamic State.
These are not united groups necessarily.
Sure, so ISIS is much more radical.
Right, and so there's the issue with the Sahel, and this is why some groups are calling for, or international aid groups are calling for change. They're saying it should be about governance, is because, like you saw in the Tuareg rebellion, there was people who don't live in the urban center, people in the rural areas, people who feel or belong to an ethnic minority that hasn't had as much advantages. Yeah. These people are being co-opted and being recruited by some of these terror groups, which have exchanged their area of operation from the Middle East, especially in the case of Islamic State. Islamic State has moved much more into sub-Saharan, into Africa, and as well South Asia. So there's a significant change with regard to that, and all these factors are coming together. They're saying, hey, so international groups are saying, let's deal with the governance issues. People aren't happy with the way they're living here. This is giving terror groups a chance to, generate more volunteers and whatnot.
Well, basically, we're seeing the poorest of the poor countries that are affected, and we're seeing this change. I think Mali was recruited for troops to fight on behalf of the Islamic State. So I don't think that this is an issue that just can be ignored. I think a lot of times you want to take a look at this and you think, okay, well, this is in Africa. But the reality is, where you see terrorism burgeoning, you'll see that the focus is ultimately going to be on towards Western countries. Right.
And so anything that happens, whenever you would give a base of operations to develop this sort of stability for sending terror abroad, I think that's always a threat. And it's, of course, a humanitarian crisis for the people living there.
Which, in fact, I think a lot of these countries are saying that actually this has been going on for some time, but they've been just under this guise of fear where they didn't want to say anything. And so you're actually seeing some of this hit the news now where it wasn't traditionally there, just out of fear.
Well, and sometimes you'll get a story here, a story there. This is an ongoing reality for the people living in Mali at the time, living in the Sahel. You know, the Sahel, it hosts 800 and about 50,000 refugees, most of them in Mali. Refugees are people who've been forced to leave their countries. Internally displaced people, numbering about 2 million. Is our estimates right now from the UNHCR.
Well, and France has involved themselves with respect to combating this in Mali and otherwise, but the real question is, I don't think anybody has an appetite to be dealing with this, but the reality is that there needs to be some sort of support for these countries in dealing with these groups. So. While we've been witnessing a slight decline in global terrorism, there are troubling signs for the concentration of jihadist groups in sub-Saharan Africa. There appears to be little option for Western countries to allow these groups to remain unchecked. The more tragic story is that the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable countries in Africa appear to be fertile ground for these groups to make territorial claims, often so at the cost of innocent lives in the name of a holy war that appears to be anything but holy. Both Nathaniel and I would like to thank you for watching Our Nation Today. Remember, keep examining and know that you are part of the solution.